Hello! So I was going to be working on my Shin Godzilla video, but then I clicked on Fringy's newest offering and I had to put that on hold. Fringy's video is entitled The Merits of Difficulty in Video Games, link in the description. For those that aren't aware, there is an ongoing and seemingly inconclusive discussion online about whether computer games should have difficulty settings as standard. A discussion usually rising to the surface when particularly hard games are released, a recent example being Elden Ring. Personally, I think that games should have difficulty settings, and so far I've not heard any good arguments for not having them. Which brings me on to Fringy. To sum up his video, Fringy points out the interactivity of games, how inclusivity is a good thing for games, how some games apply difficulty settings, and then finishes by asking lots of questions about creator intentions, expenses, narratives, and artisms. Essentially, he makes statements about what is, then asks, what if? The problem with Fringy's video is that it tackles ideas and concepts which are only as good as their practical applications. Which weirdly links to Shin Godzilla, but you're going to have to wait for that explanation. For now, I want to answer the questions Fringy poses at the end of his video. So, let's give it a try, shall we?
Here's one for you. Should players be allowed to determine the difficulty of the games they play?
Yes, I think players should be allowed to decide the difficulty of the game they are playing to suit their wants and needs. Some people want games to be challenging, others want games to be relaxing, and people can find either of these goals fun. Games like Elden Ring try to appeal to both, creating wonderful worlds to explore and admire, with mystic storytelling and enigmatic characters to entice the player along, then smashes them into the floor with a boss battle. If the game wants to appeal to more players, why not offer adjustable gameplay? All too often, arguments about difficulty settings lean into whether they should be easier, as if, somehow, that's inherently a bad thing. Rarely is the opposite brought up. If a player wants an easier time of it, if they want to run around picking flowers and chatting to weird women in strange places, they should be able to. And if a player wants to skip all the flowery bollocks and get smashed into the floor, then so be it.
What if the developers want to create a difficult game?
If the developer wants to make a difficult game, then that's their choice. They run the risk of alienating players, which they rightly should, but as we've seen, that can be countered by having die-hard fans and lofty idealists defending their games for them. Just like how mainstream films, mostly Disney's, are getting worse because people keep defending them and watching them. How long until every game is focused on extreme difficulty because popular? Already we've seen a degradation of game mechanics in Elden Ring for the sake of making things harder for players. How long until narratively intriguing and conceptually fascinating games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls before it are boiled down to Monster Smash Face Hard? Arguably, that's what happened with Dark Souls 2 and, well, enough said.
What if they don't want to dedicate resources to implementing difficulty settings at the expense of other parts of their game?
Advocating for an expense argument is pretty difficult unless we have some information on it. It might be terribly expensive and time-consuming to adjust various aspects of a game to make it harder or easier. Or it might be a quick change in the code. Fringy does give some examples of changes that can be made to games using Doom as an example, which famously has multiple difficulty settings.
How do we tweak the difficulty of an action game which sees the player fight through hordes of enemies? Well, the player could be provided more health, or alternatively, the player's weapons could be made to deal greater damage to enemies. If said enemies are driven by complex AI, that too could be tweaked to further advantage the player. Maybe dodges grant more iframes. Maybe attacks are telegraphed for longer. You get the idea. Opportunities abound. Of course, implementing such tweaks would take some work, but the task is feasible. It's really no wonder difficulty settings are a fixture of these types of games.
Then he tries to argue that some games can't so easily have difficulty settings, which theoretically is true, but what he offers as an example is telling.
Now, how do we implement difficulty settings in a platformer which sees the player contend with a set of rigidly designed levels? Could be that easier difficulties grant the player more hit points or more time to complete each level, and if the player simply does not have the dexterity to clear a jump, what can the developers do to help them without completely curtailing the platforming challenges? The answer is not much.
I can think of a couple of things that can be done. Depending on the game, the platforms could be moved closer together, or be made bigger, and moving platforms could move slower. Available difficulty options are limited only by the imagination and skill of those making them. The options available are... what did Frinny say?
You get the idea. Opportunities abound.
And then, Frinny does something which he himself has probably seen dozens of times on EFAP. After showing ignorance about other possible difficulty adjustments for platformers, he then informs us,
take the recent Mario games, which allow struggling players to use an incredibly forgiving power-up that imbues Mario with invincibility and longer jumps.
He literally countered his own argument by saying, I can't think of another possible solution to this problem, now here's another solution to this problem. What are you doing, Birdman? This shot to the foot is followed by this sentiment.
Even with the assistance of these virtual training wheels, it's still up to the player to reach the end of the level. What more could be done to help those players? And at what point does the mitigation of difficulty equate to the complete erasure of difficulty?
Fringy actually answered this question at the start.
If games are necessarily interactive, does this mean that they are also necessarily exclusive?
As someone who studied interaction design, I can say no, it doesn't. Making something interactive provides the ability to get involved in a process, making it fundamentally inclusive. More often than not, an interface has to be made idiot-proof to be accessible by as many people as possible. If an interface is unusable by an audience, it is a failed interface. Similarly, if a game is so difficult people don't want to play it, would that be a success for the difficulty or a failure of inclusive design? As a contextual example, YouTubers like Mauler and Gentle Cum Handler have expressed a lack of willingness to play Elden Ring again because there are bosses in that game they can't be asked to fight. I suppose, technically speaking, that's exclusive by way of not being entertaining, and therefore a failure on the developer's part. Getting back to the question, games can be as variably difficult and easy as there are people to play them. What some players find incredibly easy might still be hard for others. Some people like Mauler and Gentle Cum Handler make up their own rules whilst playing games like Dark Souls to make it harder for them. Similarly, I find Soulsborne's dodge delay very hard to get around, so I usually end up playing a shield bro to make it easier for me. This tactic can make some bosses harder, but it makes a lot of them easier. With this in mind, why not offer a difficulty setting rather than forcing players to make up their own? But then this might be considered subverting intended design aspects, which leads into artistic intent, which is another question Frinny asks. But before we get to that question,
what if the player surmounting an intense string of challenges bolsters the story they want to tell?
The inclusion of a story is one of the biggest supportive arguments for having difficulty settings in a game. Challenges can enhance a story for sure. Saving a princess from a terrible dragon is probably far more immersive than saving her from a pig. But a narrative can be completely buggered by having too harsh a challenge to complete. That princess can go fuck herself because I ain't dealing with GMK Godzilla. A story can't so easily be changed on the fly to make it more enticing for a player to want to overcome a difficult challenge. It can, however, be much simpler to lower the difficulty of the challenge to maintain interest.
What if the difficulty is part of their artistic vision?
If art was a shield to protect a piece of work, it would be made of paper. White paper at that. As I already mentioned, players drastically alter gameplay as much as they can to suit their needs, be it to make things easier or more difficult. If these changes go against the artistic vision of the game, should they be allowed? Should Mauler have been allowed to ignore Sir Gideon Ofnir's speech and shove a spiked spinning wheel up his arse, completely removing the boss fight? It was Zack Snyder's vision to have blurry camera work in his zombie film. It was someone's vision to sell a canvas painted red as art. It was Naughty Dog's artistic vision to take the choice away from the player at the end of The Last of Us Part 2. And it was From Software's vision to exploit their own terrible keybinds to take advantage of players. That last one probably needs clarifying. Fringy says that inclusive options for games are a good thing, which everyone should agree with. But then he says this.
Colorblind settings, rebindable controls, subtitles, all great features, none of which affect gameplay.
I fucking disagree. In some regards, key bindings are inclusivity related. Then again, tell the person who beat Dark Souls with a banana that it didn't make things more difficult. Key bindings can absolutely make things more challenging. In my video talking about the dodge mechanic of Soulsborne games, I point out how combining multiple actions onto one key causes input delays. This causes players to fail events that wouldn't otherwise have stopped them because the game didn't react as fast as they did. This forces players to preempt opposing actions and act early to avoid them. This in turn allows the game designers to make their game harder by exploiting player pre-actions. Delayed attacks, anyone? Similarly, subtitles can absolutely be a part of difficulty. Fringy mentions,
I've heard it said that games should allow players to skip past sections which are causing them grief, but I can't help but feel like that doesn't really address the problem. Most games get harder the further one progresses. Plus, what happens if players are allowed to skip past the introduction of a new weapon or item? How can such gaps in their skill and understanding be bridged?
if missing a mechanic by having a difficulty setting is bad, what if not having one causes a mechanic to be missed? Does not having subtitles make the game harder to understand, more difficult to interpret? If you missed how something works because you couldn't hear what was being said and there were no options for subtitles, does that make it okay because that adds difficulty? Both key bindings and subtitle options could come under artistic vision. It might be the developer's intent for instructions to be hard to hear, or for the controls to be difficult to use, both for the intent of creating challenges in the game. Does that make it okay for those to be a thing? The answer should be no. A developer shouldn't make it harder to actually physically play the game. That would be all sorts of ist. But then, if developers are actively encouraged to add key bindings, subtitles, and other accessibility options to their games, why not difficulty options? Do these not fall under the same umbrella? Actually, would artistic vision apply to pay-to-win mechanics? Would loot boxes and cards be fine to have in games because that's what the developer wanted? Players paying real money for digital stuff to make their games easier is a form of difficulty mode, right? Yeah, no, making a game deliberately difficult or tedious just to make a player spend real money is bad, no question. But then making a game deliberately difficult and not having a way of getting around that with difficulty modes should also be bad. I want to go back to the skipping subject for a bit. There's something I like to call the Chromagus effect. In the original World of Warcraft game, or Vanilla WoW, there was a 40-man raid called Blackwing Lair. Before the age of modern WoW, a lot of bosses were very basic to allow all players to tell what was going on. In Blackwing Lair, most bosses were tank and spank, i.e. a tank keeps the boss's attention whilst the rest of the raid group kills it or heals the tank. Most bosses were beaten in this way, with some having one additional ability to keep things interesting. The challenge would revolve around player abilities to damage, heal, or tank, take up correct positions, and adapt to whatever additional thing a boss would do. Then there was Chromagus. On top of the usual tank and spank, Chromagus had 5 different breath attacks, 5 different debuffs, constant resistance changes, all working simultaneously and even combining to make a raid group's life hell. Chromagus was a huge change in pace compared to the rest of Blackwing Lair, and stopped a lot of people in progressing to the final boss, who was arguably a lot easier. Having the ability to skip Chromagus would probably have been an acceptable decision to give players a sense of accomplishment by defeating the final boss. Chromagus would still be there to come back to, if they fancied it. So yeah, in my subjective opinion, difficulty modes should be a thing, and there are plenty of arguments for having them. Just like a lot of arguments I've heard, unfortunately, Fringy's points are incredibly general and rely on what-ifs rather than what is. Fringy makes 2 statements earlier in his video, the first being,
the conversation too often revolves around questions which are ancillary to the point.
In making his video, he does just that, strain onto points about intentions and costs and artistry, when a lot of that avoids the fundamental question of why do people want difficulty settings? And Fringy focuses on easy modes rather than the general idea of difficulty settings, which includes hard modes. I don't hear anyone commenting on the efficacy or artistic subversion of playing on hard modes. And the last thing I want to comment on that Fringy brings up is,
some would propose that difficulty settings ought to be a part of every game, and the argument supporting this conclusion seems straightforward enough. What harm comes from the mere existence of an easier mode of play? Doesn't affect you, so what the hell do you care, you fucking jerk?
This statement occurs at about the halfway point in the video, and Fringy's arguments I've covered here go towards countering this question. Obviously, in my opinion, not very well. Once again, the question has real-life examples to draw an answer from. Doom, a game Fringy depicted and used as an example of using difficulty settings, has wide appeal amongst gamers. At no point has there been a massive problem caused by its difficulty modes. If anything, they have allowed more people to enjoy Doom, to experience it, and to share that experience. Hell, you can't tell me you didn't have fun turning on all the cheats and running around killing everything with ease. So yeah, what is the harm of difficulty modes, especially in single-player games? A quick point about player versus player or PvP games. Fringy doesn't touch on this, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway. Yes, it's difficult or indeed impossible to apply difficulty settings to PvP games like Overwatch. What they do instead is apply ranking systems and pit similarly ranked players against each other, which has a similar effect to difficulty settings by matching players of similar skill. PvP games that don't have a type of ranking system are generally considered bad. So yeah, those are my thoughts on... Oh shit! New Game Plus. Elden Ring and its predecessors allow players who have completed the base game to carry on playing with their characters and start the game over in New Game Plus. This is the base game made harder, theoretically providing a significant challenge for the higher level character. This can be done 7 times. If the developers designed 7 whole levels of higher difficulty for players who completed the game, what's wrong with creating lower levels of difficulty for players who haven't? Alright, that's it, I'm done now. I hope you found this entertaining and hopefully also informative. Feel free to do all the YouTube things, and links to my Patreon and Etsy store will be in the description. Last but not least, thank you for watching.